Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Pelle, and thanks for being with us today. Every year, state lawmakers consider thousands of bills, not hundreds, thousands of bills that would change how Americans vote and how our elections are administered. Most states have already started their legislative sessions, and in fact, over the past 3 years, about 35% of all election administration bills were introduced by mid February. So we thought now would be a great time to check in on these bills and preview what we're looking for in this year's sessions and what states are up to when it comes to passing legislation related to how our elections are governed. So let's take a break from all of our, sort of presidential and federal news unfolding this week. And let's talk with Joe Greeny, our elections expert on our team, who leads our coverage of our election related legislation activity. So, Joe, welcome back. Good to see you today.
Thanks, Jeff. Super happy to be here.
Yeah, it's cold everywhere. Let's not waste time talking about that. That's just a reality of what it is. So, this is one of our more in the weeds stories we tackle on the show. So let's just remind our listeners when we say legislation related to elections administration, what do we mean by that?
Yeah, I'll try and keep it the elevator pitch pretty brief there. But elections are complex. I think that's something that's been borne out sort of over the last 4+ years. I think there's been more national attention on elections. I think we all realize there's a lot of rules, lots of different procedures. Really what it comes down to is every state administers their own elections. There are federal guidelines under which certain elections are administered. There's certain federal voting standards that states that states must live up to or must conduct their elections under those standards. But other than that, states have a lot of authority to conduct elections, to administer elections within their borders, how they would like to do so. And that leads to basically 50 competing, or not necessarily competing, but 50 different systems of election administration. And 50
Kind of
states.
opinion, it's one of the more
Yeah.
decentralized elements of our American political system. It
Yeah.
really is every state running their own set of elections, and even within some states at the county and town level. So
Absolutely.
it's pretty decentralized. Yeah, you're right. Don't undersell it. It is
Yeah.
decentralized.
So yeah, every year, well, not every year, but every odd year at least, when all 50 state legislatures convene a legislative session, we see, like you said in your intro, thousands of bills across all 50 states that would change how elections are administered, how election officials administer elections within each state. And then to your point as well, oftentimes within that legislation, there's sort of maybe local or municipal statutes that might just apply to specific elections within a specific state. So, yep, lots of
So we
sort of.
recapped all this last year in a sort of end of year episode, looking out on the whole year. But let's just do a quick top line summary. What kind of legislation did we see enacted last year? Were certain parties more active? Were there certain types of bills that were more commonly enacted than others? What was just kind of a really quick high level recap of 2024?
Sure, it was a pretty standard even year. So in even years,
Yeah.
we generally see a little bit less overall activity than in odd years. That's just due to election calendars, a couple states not holding legislative sessions, and yeah, just generally constrained timelines for a lot of legislatures. Um, all that said, we saw more bills introduced, election-related bills introduced last year in 2024 than we did in the previous even year, 2022. Less bills overall than the odd year in between 2023. So in the last 3 years, that odd year was sort of the most active year in terms of just raw number of bills. We expect to see something similar happen this year. Again, that's mostly down to legislative calendars. And then sort of last year was just a continuation of trends. I think that might be the label to apply to 2024. We saw Republican legislators and Republican-led states more active in this space than Democratic counterparts. And what that means in real terms is that more bills were adopted in states with Republican trifectas than they were in Democratic trifecta states. Or states with divided governments. And then overall, Republican-sponsored legislation was adopted. There was more Republican-sponsored legislation adopted than any other type of legislation. and it was also more likely to be adopted overall. Bipartisan legislation had a slight advantage over Republican-sponsored legislation, but across the board, Republican-sponsored legislation was the most likely to be adopted. Some of this comes down, again, to just sort of question of numbers. There were more Republican trifectas last year than Democratic trifectas in states with divided government. That was true also in the 2 previous years. There are more Republican state legislators than there are Democratic state legislators. So part of the advantage on the Republican side is just a question of numbers. That said, though, again, just in terms of likelihood of a bill to be adopted, it was more likely that Republican-sponsored legislation eventually became law. And then
What
to
are
your
some of the
point,
topics that Republicans
yeah,
were pushing, and what are some of the topics that Democrats were pushing? I mean, obviously, we're kind of really generalizing here with
yeah,
those kinds of broad topics and subjects, but just to sort of set the tone for what's ahead for this session.
totally.
But see if you can simplify it as much as you can.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit easier to generalize on the Republican side. There was more commonality between newly adopted laws amongst different Republican-led states than there was commonality amongst laws that Democratic-led states were pursuing. And some of the topics we saw sort of pop up in Republican-led legislatures in multiple states were things like legislatively referred constitutional amendments related to non-citizen voting. We saw 8 states, voters in 8 states eventually approve those amendments last year. That was not something that we saw happen in states where Democrats control the legislature. Um, I think 2 of those eventually passed in states with divided government, but in both those states, again, it was Republican-led efforts to get those questions on the ballot. Another one, common topic in Republican-led states, were bans on ranked choice voting, sort of alternative voting methods. That was another sort of continuing trend last year that we saw the same thing in Republican-led states in 22 and 23. And then generally things like voter list maintenance, voter ID, tweaks to the absentee and mail-in voting process were common topics in Republican-led states. Some of those same topics also popped up on the Democratic side of the ledger as well, particularly voter list maintenance, tweaks to absentee and mail-in voting, but sort of we're seeing different tweaks on the Democratic side. Voter list maintenance is one that's like really interesting because there's actually a lot of agreement out there. I think the narratives are a bit competing and opposed at the moment, but I think there's actually broad agreement amongst a lot of legislators on tweaks to voter roll maintenance. So that's a preview. We could get into a lot more, but it's a quick generalization.
Yeah, yeah, it makes sense. A lot, like you said, there are more states with Republican trifectas, and that didn't really change very much heading into this
So
session because there were very few trifecta changes heading into this session here. There were 2 Democratic states that actually lost their trifectas, so there will be fewer Democratic trifecta states this session year. And Texas is really one of the big X factors because Texas only holds odd year sessions, and they usually introduce and enact a higher volume of bills disproportionately to other states because they don't have an even year session to conduct business, which you sort of alluded to earlier. So, all right, we're only a few weeks into the year now. So, what are a handful of examples of some of the bills that we've seen come across our tracking so far? And just sort of as a reminder for listeners, so Ballotpedia tracks every single election administration related bill that comes in. We publish tags and summaries, and you can search through all the bills on our interactive dashboard, legislation.ballotpedia.org. We regularly produce a weekly newsletter reporting about the various bills. So we're pretty in the weeds on these, and we kind of look at them on every single day. So what are you seeing so far, Joe, when our team's been digging into the numbers and into the bills that we've seen in the
somebody's got
early
to be in the
sessions?
weeds.
All
Somebody's
right.
got to do it. Yeah, and to your point, I'm going to kind of I think circle back and touch on a couple of points that you brought up there as well, and in your intro. To we're early in the year, recording this on January 21st, 3 weeks into the new year. But the bulk of election-related legislation, which will be introduced during 2025 regular legislative sessions, has already been introduced. And today is actually sort of a tipping point day in legislative calendars. There are 44 states that are now in session as of today. 6 states have not yet convened a legislative session. So clearly the vast majority of states have started their sessions for the year, and they've got their legislative business going. So we're early, but there's still a lot to sort through. And then sort of get into your question, we're seeing sort of a continuation of the attention on these topics that we've been looking at for the last couple of years and sort of really came into focus last year as well. I think the question of citizenship status, at the time of voting, at the time of registration, is something that is going to be a topic in many states again this year. I don't think we're going to see as many legislatively referred constitutional amendments, we call them LRCAs, this year as we did last year. We're not going to see as many legislatures seeking to put measures on the ballot for voters to decide to tweak constitutional language around non-citizen voting. Although, again, we're not going to see the same numbers as last year, but we'll probably see more states pursue similar efforts this year.
And let's actually unpack that a little bit. This
Yeah.
is a sort of common topic that we've talked about here and there in the show, and it's kind of one of my sort of more favorite in the weeds conversations to have, and it's about statutes and laws versus constitutional amendment changes. And the different legislatures or citizen initiatives can take very different tactics on which direction they want to go in, based on, ease of passage, based on difficulty of enactment. And there's an important distinction here, because if you pass something via statute, a law, or an initiated statute, then the next legislature can undo that, right? They can pass a law to undo it. This is very similar to a phenomenon we're seeing this week, where, if one president passes an executive order, well, the next president can come in and with the stroke of a pen, they can undo the prior president's executive order as well. You can't simply undo a law as easily, and you certainly cannot undo a constitutional amendment as easily. So that's always very interesting to see how that all plays out. And to your point, there are only so many states that are Republican-led that would want to continue to do these LRCAs, as we call them, legislatively referred constitutional amendments, about, say, the citizenship voting issue. But there is an interesting trend right now occurring with Wisconsin and with a voter ID legislation there related to this distinction of statutes versus a constitutional amendment. So can you kind of walk through what's happening with Wisconsin?
Yeah, Wisconsin's got a unique LRCA process as well. To your point, every state does it differently. There are different thresholds involved in certain states. There are different requirements for the legislature to pass initiative language in. Sometimes they only have to pass it in one session. Sometimes they've got to pass it in consecutive sessions. Sometimes voters need to vote on the question once or twice. So Nevada, I'm going to go to Nevada before getting to Wisconsin. Nevada voted on a very similar LRCA this past November 2024. It was related to voter ID. This is another topic that we'll be paying attention to this year, and honestly every year when looking at election-related legislation. To break down the process in Nevada, just to provide a point of contrast to Wisconsin. In Nevada, the LRCA actually has to pass the legislature in one session, but then it needs to appear before voters in 2 consecutive general elections. Wisconsin's kind of got the opposite setup. An LRCA's got to pass the legislature in 2 consecutive sessions, and then it appears before voters. So that's actually what just happened in Wisconsin at the beginning of this year. Is the legislature passed what they call the second consideration of an LRCA that would require voters to present a form of identification. I'm actually not super familiar with the specifics of that requirement right now, so that we can dig into, though, because every voter ID requirement has sort of different caveats, different exceptions. It's a whole separate conversation. But the passage of that second consideration in Wisconsin means that ballot measure will appear before voters this year at the state's November statewide general election. So yeah, that's another one. In addition to the non-citizen voting related LRCAs, voter ID is another one where now we're gonna have the second state in 2 years, voters in a second state in 2 years, deciding whether or not to require voter ID while voting. voter ID, just to like use that as a segue to talk about the topic, separate from LRCAs, there are a number of states where similar requirements have been introduced as just regular legislation, not as LRCAs, not as potential ballot initiatives or ballot questions. So we are seeing sort of a renewed interest in requiring a voter to present ID before voting. Again, this is a topic that sort of shakes out along partisan lines. If you look at the breakdown right now on where voter ID is required, where it's not required, there's a couple outliers. There's a couple of Democratic trifecta states that require voter ID. They require voters to present ID before voting. And the opposite, there's a couple Republican trifecta states, Republican-led states, Republican-leaning states, however you want to sort of classify the political grouping, where voters aren't required to present voter ID. But on the whole, Republican lawmakers in general are more supportive of the idea of requiring voters to present ID before voting. I don't think there's necessarily strong opposition to the idea on the Democratic side, but there's certainly not enthusiasm either, or less enthusiasm than on the Democratic side, than on the Republican side. So just a couple other states where we've seen similar provisions introduced already this year are Connecticut, Virginia, Pennsylvania, Utah. So a mix of Democratic trifecta, divided government states, Republican trifecta states. It's definitely a topic that we're going to be following closely this year, and we'll probably see popping up elsewhere.
Yeah, and what's really interesting with that is, some of the states, like, to your point, they don't have any kind of the sort of voter ID law on the books right now.
Yeah, Virginia's
Whereas in
got a
Wisconsin, they do have one on the books already, and what they're trying to do is simply strengthen it by putting it directly into the Constitution, so that, in theory, if the legislature, switched partisan control, or if a court threw out an existing law, they would have it in the Constitution already. And we've seen the same tactic over the last few years on the abortion issue, where there are some states where they're passing specific ballot measures to put language about abortion directly into a constitution, which is a sort of is meant to be a sort of strengthening check against legislative balance of power changing back and forth. So we're seeing the same thing play out in the elections administration space right now as well.
I'd love to, sorry to interrupt you, Jeff, but I'd love to very
No, man.
quickly dig into Virginia and Utah, the two
Yeah,
the
what's
four
going on
states
there?
I just mentioned.
Yeah.
Just to get into sort of, to your point, to further emphasize sort of the idiosyncrasies between states, the level of specificity we're talking about sometimes, and sort of the wrinkles, the details, et cetera, et cetera. So Virginia is actually a state where on paper, a voter is already required to present a valid identification before voting. What they've got is a pretty large exception to that requirement, which allows almost any voter to sign an affidavit, basically attesting to certifying their own identity.
Yeah,
And it allows,
Michigan put something like this on a couple of years ago as well. Yep.
exactly.
Mhm.
So same sort of ideas in Wisconsin.
Yep.
There already is a requirement, but a certain group of lawmakers would like to strengthen that requirement, would like to eliminate the exceptions, and generally just modify how that policy is implemented and what it looks like in practice. Utah is another really interesting one. Utah is one of just a handful of states that we at Ballotpedia call all mail voting states, where every registered voter is mailed an absentee/mail-in ballot ahead of an election. It basically means that voting by mail is the default. It doesn't mean you can't vote in person. It doesn't mean you can't vote early. It just means that if you are a registered voter in a specific time frame before an election in which you're going to be eligible to vote in, you will receive a ballot in the mail, regardless of how you would like to vote, what you feel about absentee mail-in voting.
It's like Colorado or like that, Washington as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's really popular in Utah, which is a state with a Republican trifecta. Absentee voting in general has been a bit of a question mark amongst Republican politicians for a couple of years now. I think we've seen a little bit of back and forth on sort of support, opposition. I think and just zeroing in on Utah to sort of not get into the bigger debate right now. It's a Republican trifecta state where voting by mail is actually really popular. The new requirement, and reason why you don't need to provide ID to vote by mail on a state like Utah is because if you're receiving the ballot, theoretically, the election officials that are sending you the ballot understand that you are an eligible voter for this election. They know your identity. You don't need to provide identity to receive that ballot. You're on the voter roll. You're an identified and eligible voter. That's not satisfying to everyone. And I definitely understand why. So in Utah, they're moving towards potentially requiring all mail voting, but requiring those voters to return their ballots in person and to provide an ID before returning that ballot. So it would be sort of a hybrid of the all mail voting system, which is in place in a couple of different states. And actually, Utah is the only state with a Republican trifecta that has that system. So it would be interesting to see them move to sort of a hybrid all mail voting, but requiring in-person delivery and ID at time of ballot drop-off. So it's sort of an interesting sort of evolution in ID and all mail voting.
Every state basically looks at their prior election, how they ran, how they did, and then, thinks to themselves, legislators think, okay, well, what do we want to do to tweak it? What do we want to do in our state, to our rules and our systems to sort of, improve upon how we think we run elections? So always interesting to see how that's going to shake out. And it's very early in the session, but we'll be following that very closely. What else do we have lined up, Joe, for our own coverage in the next few months? What are you excited about that we've got ready and cooking?
Yeah. Thanks for the opportunity to plug some stuff. We definitely got a lot of really interesting analysis on the way this year. I would just say to our listeners, be on the lookout for all that. Go check our year-end report from December last year for a sense of what you'll be seeing more of this year. I know we're going to be releasing a sort of longer form report coming in March with some interesting analysis of some other election-related topics. So be on the lookout for all of that. And then just state-specific and topic-specific stories as well. I think there are always states that draw sort of outsized attention and focus, and our attention will be there, but also on sort of the other states and the other topics that might not get as much attention. So you mentioned it earlier. Texas is a big one to watch this year. They don't hold even year session, so they've got 2 years of activity to catch up on this year already. A couple hundred bills introduced. States last year in the presidential cycle that drew a lot of attention that are going to be in the focus this year again: Pennsylvania, Arizona, and then topics generally we touched on a few here, but I think the absentee voting process is going to be sort of in the targets for state legislators across the partisan spectrum and all around the country. Same sort of thing for early voting and the in-person voting process. We're seeing a lot of tweaks come through already. So we'll have sort of topic-specific, state-specific analysis of all that and some longer form stuff coming later in the year.
Yeah. Elections administration is the kind of thing that people really care about in the weeks before and during and after an election. But really, those rules are baked in right now during sort of the odd year, 18, 24 months in advance of the election. So this is when it'll all shake out. We'll have you back on the show to dig into it more in the next few months ahead. So, Joe, thanks for being here today.
Thanks, Jeff.
For our listeners on the podcast, you can learn more about our election coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you're subscribed to On the Ballot wherever you listen or watch podcasts. I'm Jeff Palley, and thanks for listening.